Hello and welcome to This Really Happened, a place where unbelievable, heart-touching true stories come to life. Sometimes surprising, sometimes bittersweet, always real. Grab a drink and settle in. We're about to begin. Sarah walked home from the bus stop. It was the very beginning of spring, and dusk was falling much later than it had been recently. Just 2 weeks ago, it was completely dark at this time, but now the sky was painted in light lilac tones. In her hands were 2 heavy bags of groceries. Inside were fruits for Alice, fresh bread, a large piece of meat for borscht and goulash, and, of course, her daughter's favourite treats. Today, Sarah had received an advance payment, and tomorrow she and Alice would have their traditional Friday movie night. Sarah smiled involuntarily, thinking of her daughter. Alice was the only thing that made her life truly happy, full, and meaningful. The girl was now 8 years old. She attended a nearby school and was an excellent student. Sarah hardly helped her with homework, only occasionally participating in joint projects. She really wanted to spend more time with her child, but she had to work a lot, to provide for the 2 of them. However, Alice managed perfectly well on her own. She grew up to be a very responsible, clever, and independent girl. From the 1st grade, she had to do everything herself, leave for school when her mother was already on her way to work, return to an empty apartment, tidy up, eat lunch, and sit down to do her homework. Alice set her own alarm clock so she wouldn't be late for basketball practice at her school. The coach noted her iron character and saw great prospects in sports. Sarah often thought her daughter was a real miracle. Sarah smiled again, remembering Alice. She was truly incredibly lucky to have such a daughter. But her heart still ached when she saw other children surrounded by the care of loving adults. These children had more time for games. They were looked after and protected. Loving grandmothers, grandfathers, stay-at-home mothers, fathers, they all made the little ones' lives happier. Their world seemed brighter and safer. At first, Sarah was very worried. Her little daughter walked everywhere completely alone with a huge backpack. Colleagues constantly expressed their surprise and concern. They asked if she wasn't afraid that Alice might be taken away by a bad person, attacked by a dog, or get lost. Sarah just sighed heavily, for all these fears were, of course, present in her soul. But she was confident in her daughter. She knew that Alice wouldn't go with a stranger and would find her way home. The girl was surprisingly mature for her age, attentive, sensitive, and smart. Sarah simply had no other choice. She couldn't afford to stay home with the child. Changing jobs to something closer was also impossible because the brick factory where she worked as an economist paid very well. Getting that job had cost her enormous effort, but now her salary was above the city average. This money was enough for everything they needed: clothes, apartment rent, groceries, and even small entertainments. If Sarah earned less, she and Alice simply wouldn't be able to survive. Then Eleanor would have been able to fulfill her long-held dream. This thought frightened Sarah the most. Remembering her former mother-in-law, Sarah shivered. Eleanor was a terrible person, although once she had seemed so sweet and benevolent. Sarah remembered well how nervous she had been many years ago when James brought her, already pregnant with Alice, to meet his parents. She understood how their situation looked from the outside. A village girl without a penny to her name had snared a guy from a rich family. It seemed she had deliberately gotten pregnant so that James would be forced to marry her like an honest man. This was a common viewpoint. In reality, everything was completely different. But even Sarah's classmates, who knew her very well, drew similar conclusions. Red-haired Chloe sincerely congratulated her upon hearing the news. She said that Sarah, who seemed so quiet and proper, had managed to arrange her life in a way they could only dream of. Chloe called it an excellent plan and even suggested trying to do the same. After all, becoming the wife of a rich husband seemed like a normal desire. The girls weren't mocking, they were genuinely happy for their friend. It seemed to them that Sarah had pulled off a risky scheme and won, getting a proposal from an eligible bachelor. After such a reaction from her friends, Sarah realized that everyone else thought exactly the same way. She imagined how James's parents looked at her, like an enemy. Of course, a village outsider had come to the city and decided to establish herself here through a profitable marriage. Sarah was sure that was exactly what they thought. James indeed came from a very wealthy family, but Sarah didn't find this out right away. The guy dressed simply, jeans, t-shirts, comfortable sneakers. Only later did it turn out that his watch and mobile phone were very expensive. An experienced person would have noticed this immediately, but how was a village girl supposed to know the cost of such things? To her, they were just a watch and just a phone. Usually, James came to the university on a motorcycle. Many other students arrived in expensive cars, and their families' wealth was immediately apparent from them. But here was a motorcycle, which Sarah didn't consider that expensive, accessible to many. It seemed to her that anyone could afford a bike. James also worked part-time as a courier for a large real estate firm. Sarah wasn't surprised by his motorcycle, thinking he had saved up for it or taken out a loan. At the beginning of their relationship, James didn't mention that this firm belonged to his father. The girl couldn't even imagine how successful and wealthy his parents were. For her, it was completely unexpected. For a long time, Sarah only observed James from afar. They studied in different faculties of the university. The guy was a student of the prestigious Finance and Economics program. After school, Sarah had very much wanted to enroll there. She studied hard, spending days and nights poring over textbooks, but unfortunately, she didn't pass the competition for that faculty. Her dream didn't come true. Sarah, a poor girl from the village, desperately wanted to escape poverty. She had wonderful, kind, and understanding parents who always supported her, but she didn't want to repeat their fate. They lived in a small house without plumbing, with a wash basin on the wall and a toilet outside. The bathhouse was only heated on weekends, and despite her parents' hard work, there was always a shortage of money in the family. Sarah saw that other families in the village lived exactly the same way, surviving on tiny salaries with a lack of jobs. People didn't despair, they persevered and survived. But Sarah didn't wish such a fate for herself. She dreamed of a different, better life. Her parents fully supported her desire to get an education and stay in the city. They tried not to burden Sarah with household chores so that all her time could be devoted to studying. Her mother instructed her, "Study, daughter, don't be lazy, you'll make something of yourself." Her father added that her teacher considered her smart and promising. Sarah was indeed the best in her class. Studying came easily to her. She saw the university entrance exams as a decisive battle for a happy life. The girl endured this battle with dignity, scoring many points, which pleasantly surprised her. However, these points were still not enough to get into the state-funded department of the Finance and Economics faculty. Her dream proved unattainable. Sarah felt deep disappointment and surprise. She had been the best in her school and didn't understand why so many people had surpassed her. Only later did she learn about tutors and gifts in the dean's office. But then she blamed only herself, thinking she hadn't prepared well enough. She was only a few points short of getting into the state-funded program. Meanwhile, she could easily get into the commercial department. An unfamiliar older female student, seeing Sarah crying by the results board, tried to comfort her. She said that one could study for a year or two on a paid basis and then transfer to the state-funded program after someone dropped out. The older student added that smart and determined students like her, who were just a few points short, were usually liked and supported. Sarah just shook her head heavily, understanding that even a year's tuition fee was an impossible amount for her family. She had already resigned herself to the year being lost. She would have to return to the village and prepare for admission again, but even that didn't guarantee success the following year. But that same chance encounter with the older student offered a completely different option. She shrugged and asked why Sarah needed that finance and economics faculty. There, according to her, mostly connected people and children of rich parents studied, while the same education, even better and with less pretense, was offered at the Faculty of Enterprise Economics. Sarah was incredibly grateful to her accidental saviour and even tried to find her later to thank her. It turned out that her points were more than enough for the other faculty. So Sarah finally became a student. As a student from the village, she was given a place in the dormitory and a social scholarship. Sarah couldn't believe her luck for a long time. Her dream of city life and education was beginning to come true. Sarah studied very diligently, attended all lectures, and submitted her assignments on time. Professors praised her and held her up as an example to other students. This sometimes made Sarah feel a little awkward. The girl devoted all her time and energy to studying. However, the scholarship wasn't enough, and she had to work part-time in the evenings as a seller in a bakery near the dormitory. Her parents couldn't help financially, and Sarah managed as best she could. She had absolutely no time left for student parties and entertainments. Sometimes she felt a little sad about this, but each time she remembered her goal, and that helped her keep going. Her classmates often enthusiastically told Sarah about their weekends. They shared details of romantic adventures and described their admirers. At such moments, Sarah also dreamed of a decent young man by her side. She wanted to meet a loving, caring, cheerful, and of course, handsome guy she could fall deeply in love with. But those who came into her view weren't suitable for the role of a prince. Many were handsome and cheerful, but seemed too carefree, frivolous, and selfish to Sarah. She couldn't imagine her future with any of them. The girl was waiting for someone special. Her friends jokingly called Sarah a bore. When she refused to go to parties, they threatened her with a lonely old age with a dozen cats. But in her 4th year, Sarah finally saw a guy who made her heart beat faster. She was surprised she hadn't noticed him before. The young man made a striking entrance into the parking lot on a black motorcycle. He was in jeans, a black t-shirt, and a helmet. What exactly attracted Sarah to him then? Perhaps the way he skillfully handled the motorcycle or his particular graceful posture. At that moment, he reminded her of a prince on a noble steed. Anyway, Sarah, who was hurrying to the library, stopped. She watched from afar as the motorcyclist removed his helmet. For some reason, she really wanted to see his eyes. It would have been better if she hadn't, because when James, as if sensing her gaze, looked in her direction, Sarah knew she was lost. His piercing turquoise eyes, snow-white smile, and wheat-coloured hair struck her. Sarah could have looked at him forever. What would he think of her? Sarah suddenly felt awkward, standing and staring at a stranger. She turned sharply and hurried towards the library building. The guy caught up with her almost at the entrance to the building. He gently held Sarah by the arm. She turned around and blushed, meeting his slightly mocking but warm gaze. The stranger smiled at her openly and sincerely. Sarah had never experienced such feelings. It was hard to describe. Goosebumps ran down her body, warmth spread through her, and her heart pounded like crazy. That day, Sarah and James's romance began. At first it was beautiful, like a magical fairy tale, but it ended more like a bad horror movie. James confessed that he felt her gaze and knew from her eyes that he could be happy with her. Later, Sarah realized that he was simply tired of spoiled girls from rich families. They were selfish princesses who couldn't be surprised by anything. And then a simple, unsophisticated, and very pretty girl from the village appeared. Sarah looked at James with loving eyes, hung on his every word, and admired everything about him. She was happy about little things, like a bouquet of roses, and was amazed by the luxury of restaurants. James found it interesting to observe the emotions of a girl who wasn't spoiled. He opened up a completely new world to the poor student. This flattered his ego and instilled belief in his own power. Of course, James also developed some feelings for the girl for whom he became everything. It couldn't have been otherwise, but he never intended to make Sarah the center of his universe. She realized all this much later, when the problems began. But at first, it seemed to her that James was performing one feat after another for her. The guy spent money on her generously. Sarah felt awkward and tried to refuse gifts. She knew perfectly well how hard money was to come by. James worked as a courier and earned money, but that wasn't a reason to spend everything on her. He just smiled at her objections and gave her another luxurious gift. Their relationship resembled sometimes a romantic comedy, sometimes a beautiful melodrama. James was so sweet and attentive. He courted her incredibly beautifully and always knew how to cheer Sarah up. Sarah still studied a lot, but now studying didn't occupy her whole life. Amazingly, she had enough time for everything, dates with James and her studies. It was a wonderful and unforgettable time. James and Sarah had been dating for about a year when the girl realized with horror that she was pregnant. At first, she couldn't believe it, as they had been so careful. But the tests stubbornly showed 2 lines. She had to accept this fact, and Sarah fell into despair. Her diploma and state exams were approaching, the final stretch after so many years of study. The pregnancy could interfere with the final tests. Even if she wrote her thesis and passed the exams, by the end of her 5th year, she would have a big belly. Who would hire her in such a state? She would have to stay home with the child. And then what was the point of all those 5 years of study? Sarah felt her dreams crashing down. Would James be happy about this news? Would he take responsibility for her and the child? Their relationship seemed elevated and trusting. But a beautiful romance is one thing, and a burden in the form of a pregnant girl is quite another. Sarah cried for about an hour from despair, hurt, and fear for the future. Then she calmed down and decided to tell James everything. James received the news of the pregnancy unexpectedly joyfully. To him it still seemed like a game. His eyes lit up, and he exclaimed with a smile, "Wow, we're going to be parents. We'll have our own little one. Cool." He was happy about the child like a new toy. Sarah didn't notice this then, happy that the man she loved didn't see the pregnancy as a problem. She felt relieved. "And what are we going to do now?" Sarah asked hopefully, looking at James. He smiled, putting his arm around her shoulders, and replied, "We'll get married, of course. We'll finish studying, then I'll go to work, and you'll go on maternity leave." Sarah was very worried about housing. She would surely be asked to leave the dormitory soon, and she would have to move. She thought maybe they would live in James's apartment, but living with his parents seemed complicated. James shrugged and said they would live in his apartment. It turned out his father had given it to him a long time ago. The apartment was large and spacious, and, according to James, Sarah should like it. He would have moved there long ago, but his mother had set a condition, only after getting married. "And now I'm getting married," James concluded. Sarah couldn't believe what she was hearing. "You have an apartment?" she asked again, surprised. She knew little about James's family, as he always avoided talking about it. James grimaced annoyedly. "What's there to tell about them? Parents are parents." He said his mother was a housewife. She spent her whole life looking after him and his brothers, taking them to clubs. In total, she had 3 sons, as he had already mentioned. His father, he said, ran his own business, a real estate agency. "Didn't I tell you?" James asked. Sarah shook her head. He had never mentioned that the firm where he worked as a courier belonged to his father. "Well, now I'm telling you," James replied. He assured her they would have a place to live, and added that he needed to introduce her to his parents. James thought his mother would be happy to know that he could also be responsible, not just his older brothers. Sarah was very afraid of the upcoming meeting with James's parents. The guy was sure that both his father and mother would like her. Sarah herself strongly doubted this. She understood that no one would believe she didn't know about James's wealth. Even her friends thought she had deliberately gotten pregnant by a rich kid. What could she expect from his relatives? But the meeting went surprisingly well. Although Sarah was initially lost in the luxurious interiors of the mansion where James's parents lived. A table was set in the living room. Everything looked appetizing, but from nervousness, Sarah couldn't swallow anything. James's parents introduced themselves. Eleanor, the future mother-in-law, smiled openly. She had the same piercing turquoise eyes as her son. Sarah was amazed at how young James's mother looked. Eleanor was much older than Sarah's mother, but there were no wrinkles on her face. She had a slim figure, flawless skin, and a stylish dress. James's father, Arthur, also looked fit and energetic, not at all his age. In conversation, James's parents turned out to be pleasant and simple people, despite their wealth. Upon hearing Sarah's story, Eleanor was delighted. She praised the girl, calling her smart and noting her amazing determination. Arthur added that he needed people like her. He promised to hire her at his firm after her maternity leave. Sarah didn't have to worry about future employment. Sarah couldn't believe her luck. Everything happening seemed like a fairy tale. James's parents not only didn't express dissatisfaction, but were genuinely happy for her. Eleanor, smiling, said that their rascal needed exactly this kind of girl. She called Sarah responsible, serious, and hard-working. Eleanor expressed joy at meeting her. It seemed like true happiness to her. Sarah didn't understand then why the parents called James a rascal. It seemed to her that he was quite a serious and conscious young man. Yes, he sometimes rode his motorcycle dangerously and spent a lot of time with friends. But James was still very young and carefree. The desire to have fun at that age seemed quite natural to Sarah. James's parents arranged a lavish wedding for the young couple. Sarah was embarrassed that they covered all the expenses. Her parents were also uncomfortable. But Eleanor behaved so simply and naturally that the tension gradually disappeared. She spoke kindly and respectfully with Sarah's parents, thanking them for raising a wonderful daughter. The mother-in-law smiled warmly at her daughter-in-law and showered her with compliments. In the dress chosen and paid for by Eleanor, Sarah looked like a real princess. In such an outfit, the bride behaved accordingly. It was an unforgettable day. James was proud of his beautiful young wife. For the first half of the wedding, he didn't let go of her hand. But after the official part, as always, he ran off to his friends. Sarah was happy for him then. She liked that he was so sociable and cheerful. Married life also seemed like a fairy tale at first. Sarah lived in a huge, stylishly furnished apartment, the interiors of which she had only seen in magazines before. It took her a long time to get used to being the full mistress of this splendor. She got her own bank card, onto which James transferred a large sum twice a month for household expenses. Accustomed to saving, Sarah at first didn't even manage to spend this money. It was wonderful and unusual to buy everything she wanted in the store instead of looking for items on sale. Her relationship with James's parents was excellent. Sarah considered them family. Eleanor often invited her over, and they talked for a long time. Sarah told her about her life, and her mother-in-law about hers. It turned out that Eleanor was also born and raised in a village, and then moved with her family to the city. There, still very young, she met Arthur, her future husband. He was a simple accountant at a factory back then. Later, Arthur started his own business, and Eleanor helped him, supporting him in everything. She considered it their shared creation. Eleanor often said that she had always dreamed of a daughter. "I wanted a daughter so much, but we only had boys," she recalled. The youngest, Jamie, was born only because she hoped for a girl. It was her last attempt, but again a boy was born. Strangely enough, he became the most loved of the three sons, although at first she was very disappointed, being sure she was carrying a daughter. The two older sons gave Eleanor 4 grandsons, but even here she didn't get to cuddle a girl. "I dream of buying dolls for my granddaughter, braiding her pigtails, choosing little dresses," she said. Again, boys with their train sets, construction kits, and toy cars. "No, I adore them, of course, but I really want something cute, girly, pink," she confessed. "You're my only hope now," added her mother-in-law. Before this conversation, Sarah didn't care about the baby's sex. But after her mother-in-law's revelations, she suddenly realized that she also dreamed of a girl. She wanted the baby to have turquoise eyes like James's and long, beautiful hair. It really was wonderful, braiding pigtails, tying bows, and of course dressing the baby in pink dresses. James, on the other hand, said he dreamed of a son. But Sarah increasingly felt that he didn't care about this child at all. He spent a lot of time at work, and in the evenings and on weekends he ran off to his friends. This was nothing like the beginning of their relationship. Sarah hoped that James would settle down after the baby was born, but she was wrong. Everything only got worse. Alice was born on time. When this tiny red creature was placed on Sarah's chest, she knew, from this moment on, her life had changed forever. Now she was a mother. James and his parents arranged a lavish discharge from the maternity hospital for Sarah. There was everything: an entertainer, balloons, flowers, emotional relatives, and a cameraman. Eleanor reverently took the pink bundle into her arms. Finally, her long-held dream had come true. She had her longed-for granddaughter. James also seemed happy and posed with his daughter for the photographer. But Sarah immediately noticed that he was bored with it all. There was no genuine joy in the young father's eyes. Sarah didn't see even a glimmer of the delight she or her mother-in-law felt. Family routines flowed, and Sarah completely immersed herself in caring for her daughter. Eleanor often visited them, teaching her daughter-in-law how to care for the baby. Sarah was a first-time mother and initially didn't know anything. But the learning wasn't difficult, and very soon Sarah felt more confident. Eleanor continued to come, and the girl didn't object, seeing how her mother-in-law rejoiced in her granddaughter. It was wonderful that someone else, besides the parents, loved the child. Especially since James didn't show much interest in Alice. The daughter seemed to irritate him. He grimaced when the girl cried, especially at night, and complained about sleepless nights. James didn't get up for the baby, Sarah always did. But he was irritated by the nighttime awakenings that disturbed his sleep. James spent more and more time away from home. The young husband might not even come home to sleep. To Sarah's questions, he replied that he wasn't her slave and had the right to rest from the family. Gradually, the rose-coloured glasses fell from Sarah's eyes. James showed his true face. Now it was clear why Eleanor called him a rascal and said he had air in his head. James was completely unprepared for family life. He was burdened by childcare. At parties, he gladly held his well-dressed daughter in his arms, admiring himself and proud of his new role. But on ordinary days, he avoided contact with the baby. He now preferred not to talk to Sarah. This was hurtful and confusing. Eventually, Sarah learned the reason for his behaviour. One morning, she accidentally overheard James talking. He thought she was asleep after rocking Alice, who wasn't feeling well, for 3 hours. But Sarah, from exhaustion, couldn't fall asleep and heard everything. James was softly cooing with some very young girl, calling her Bunny and my love. He laughed and promised that they would have fun soon. Sarah lay in bed, barely restraining herself from bursting into the kitchen and causing a scene. But she understood that it would lead nowhere. James had long become almost a stranger to her. They lived together, and James fully provided for her and Alice. What could she give her daughter if she left now? She had to pretend she hadn't heard anything. Since then, Sarah often noticed signs of James's infidelity. Girls called him at home, and he hardly hid it. In his wife's presence, he spoke more reservedly, but it was still obvious. James might return in the morning, explaining it as business meetings. There was often a bracelet from a nightclub on his wrist, and his clothes smelled of women's perfume. Sometimes he went on business trips for several days, returning refreshed and even tanned. Sarah endured all this, feeling humiliated, crushed, and lost. She still loved James and, until recently, believed that he also had feelings. She thought he had just cooled off a bit, as happens after a child is born. For some men, it's a test of strength. But James, it turned out, didn't just have an affair, but probably affairs. He addressed his interlocutors differently, sometimes Christina, sometimes Elena, sometimes Carolina. After putting Alice to bed, Sarah often cried, curled up in the armchair by the crib. She understood that her situation was desperate. Living with a husband who constantly cheated was unbearable. James had long looked at her as if she were nothing. Sarah couldn't remember the last time they had a heart-to-heart conversation. She knew she had to leave, otherwise she would soon lose herself. But what to do next? Where to go with a small daughter in her arms? To a rented apartment, of course. But then she would have to go back to work, and Alice was still tiny and would often get sick at daycare. Who needed an employee who was constantly on sick leave? Finding a job in such a situation would be very difficult. Returning to the village wasn't an option either. Sarah had put in so much effort to escape from there. She didn't want to condemn her daughter to life in a tiny house without amenities. She had to come up with something else. Her mother-in-law, Eleanor, continued to visit them often. Each time she brought Alice luxurious gifts, designer dresses, gold earrings, expensive dolls. It was clear that she doted on her granddaughter. Sarah, as the mother of this long-awaited princess, also received attention and gifts. The sensitive Eleanor noticed that her daughter-in-law was sad and asked her directly, but Sarah avoided answering, citing fatigue or a headache. Sarah had no doubt that Eleanor was a wonderful person, but how could she tell her about the humiliation she had to endure every day? But one day, Sarah realized she couldn't stand it anymore. She had to act. It happened on a rainy autumn evening. James came home late, saying he had been at a business dinner. Sarah pretended to believe him, as usual, but then she accidentally saw a photo on his phone when he was smiling happily, scrolling through his feed. Glancing at the screen, she froze. In the photo, James was hugging a beautiful blonde. She was pressing against him tenderly and smiling widely. It was a selfie. And then Sarah's visor dropped. Without wanting to, she burst into a shout. "What is this?" James raised his completely calm eyes to her. The photo, his indifference and calmness, as if there was nothing unusual about the situation, finally drove Sarah over the edge. Long-suppressed emotions erupted in sobs and insults. She screamed hurtful words in his face, called him names, wanting to wound him deeply. Sarah expected him to start making excuses or ask for forgiveness, but he just looked at her with a mixture of pity and disgust and remained silent. Suddenly, losing control, Sarah slapped James hard. Putting all her strength into the blow, she made it quite forceful. As if in slow motion, she saw his head snap back sharply. He even had to grab the table to keep from falling. Sarah got what she wanted. She broke through her husband's cold indifference. James looked at her with such malice that she went cold with horror. The man approached with long strides and grabbed her hair tightly. Sarah felt